So what exactly is reverse proxying? Simply put, a reverse proxy acts as an intermediary between a client, for example a browser, and the resource itself. For example, the most common use case on Nginx is one we've already covered, PHP. When we implement a PHP backend using PHP FPM, Nginx acted as a reverse proxy between the client and PHP FPM. So in other words, interpreting the client's request, fetching that request from PHP FPM, and then sending it back to the client, hence the term reverse, with the client assuming all requests are coming to and from the Nginx server. This is of course a very powerful feature for many applications, but in the context of Nginx as a web server, it will most often be used to proxy some or other backend service, be that PHP, Node.js, Ruby, etc. I still have that Nginx server from the previous lesson running. Hello from Nginx. So to demonstrate the most basic reverse proxy, I'll start a new web server using PHP, again with that response style which echoes hello from PHP. Test that's working, port 9999, which it is. Now let's say we want to access this PHP server via our Nginx server, this one on port 8888. And we want to do so by accessing the /php path or request URI. I'll switch back to the Nginx configuration file we're using, create that new location block for /php, and now to proxy requests on this path to the PHP server, we can say proxy_pass, which should look familiar from the PHP backend lesson, http localhost 9999. The full URL of that PHP server, with a trailing slash, which is important and we'll cover in a minute. I'll just wrap this in quotes to make it a bit more readable. Reload the Nginx server with the S flag and reload. And now test this reverse proxy by requesting that /php request on our Nginx server. Hello from PHP server. So a response clearly from our PHP server, but accessed and reverse proxied via our Nginx server. Curl again without the /php, and again we're back to getting the Nginx response as before. There is of course no restrictions to this proxied server or service being on the same system either. For example, I'll create a third location block, listening for nginx.org, and proxy this one to nginx.org, so a remote site. Reload the configuration, try that nginx.org path, and we get a whole bunch of HTML. I'll access it via the browser, where it loads as if we're visiting nginx.org directly. So a completely remote website being proxied via our server. Now, when I mentioned the importance of keeping the trailing slash on the proxied URL, the reason for this is because of how Nginx handles proxied paths. To demonstrate, I'll create a new PHP script to pass to our PHP server, call it show_request.php, open that new file, and in here I'm simply going to echo out the request URI as received on the PHP server. So in other words, what our Nginx proxy is requesting. Path server request URI. Save that and launch the PHP server with that new file, show_request. Okay, now when we call this Nginx server, the PHP server receives / or root. So there's no request being passed to the PHP server. If, however, I change the proxied path in the Nginx configuration file to not include the trailing slash, like so, curl again, we get /php. So the entire URI as we requested it from the Nginx proxy server. What this means then is that unless we specify a proxy path, Nginx assumes the original request path. Now, sure, you can create use cases for this, but ultimately it's inconsistent and not recommended. So add that request URI to the proxied URL. In this case, when having the URL specified as before, we can still pass a custom request after the proxy path. Say php/sum/URL. And what the PHP server receives is that last part, some URL. Don't worry too much about the double slashes at the start here. It's just how Nginx handles the URL substitution, but it's normalized automatically and shouldn't cause any issues. This then being a logical approach to passing request URIs to a proxied server. Okay, another important aspect of using Nginx as a reverse proxy is passing custom headers to either the proxied server, our PHP server in this case, or to the client on the reverse part of the proxy. First, we can pass headers to the client using the standard add header directive. I'll name this header proxied with a value of Nginx. Reload our configuration and test by curling that PHP path. And we see the header. Remember, however, this is being added to the client only on the reverse part of the proxy. So to add a header that gets sent to the proxied server, our PHP server, we have to change this slightly. First, let's modify that show request file to print out all request headers. var dump get all headers. If you're not familiar with PHP, var dump is just a very verbose way of logging out a variable, or the return value of this function in our case. Restart the PHP server, test that. We get all our headers, but of course not that proxied header we added, as that's going to the client. To add this to the proxy request then, we can simply change add header to proxy set header, meaning set this header on the proxy request. Reload and curl that again, and this time the very first value of this dumped headers array is that proxied header with the value Nginx. That wraps up using Nginx as a reverse proxy, which, as you can see, Nginx makes very easy. In the next lesson, we'll apply what we've learned here to create a basic load balancer.